Hi, I'm Thomas Homer Dixon. I'm the director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. I'm also a faculty member at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, and I specialize in applications of complex systems science to social challenges, solving the big problems that human societies face, such as climate change and the zero carbon energy transition.
Okay, that's a lot of highfalutin terminology, but let me just mention that I got to know you because I cite a paper of yours for the last 25 years, I think, in my undergraduate social psychology classes. I have a final section on global social problems, and I open up with the discussion of your paper in Scientific American, which talks about the confounding of the problems of overpopulation, destruction of the environment, and intergroup conflict. And you kind of made some predictions about 25 years ago and had some prescriptions. And unfortunately, the predictions seem to be coming true. But perhaps there hasn't been enough people listening to the prescriptions. Nevertheless, I find that yeah, the paper seems even more true now than it did 25 years ago.
So that paper really reflects work that I started when I first came out of graduate school. So I did my doctorate at MIT, and I was in the program of international relations and defense and arms control studies. So we were looking at the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the strategic arms race. And I was particularly interested in why human conflict happens, why people fight each other and kill each other in large numbers. Could we get ourselves into this kind of ridiculous situation with this arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union? So that had been the focus of my research for many years, but I'm also fundamentally an environmentalist and very concerned about the state of the world's environment. So when I left MIT, I decided that I would try to bring those two areas together to look at how environmental stress of various kinds might contribute to conflict. And that paper in Scientific American was an overview of our theory about how water scarcity or shortages of forests and cropland, and maybe eventually climate change could contribute to massive conflict within societies. And it was interesting because as I worked on those problems over many years with a team of researchers in Toronto, I realized that our basic understanding of causation, of how things produce chains of effects in the world, was not terribly well developed, especially in the social sciences and political science. Our ideas of causation were very simplistic at the time. So that's what led me into complex systems theory, because I needed a better understanding of how a whole bunch of different factors could combine to produce a particular outcome.
Right. So the other thing is that I have recently finished reading your book here, Commanding Hope. And in it, you talk about how, in fact, that paper in Scientific American and some other stuff I've read of yours, you said that you've been labeled as a kind of a doommeister or something. I forget the term you used.
Yeah, doommeister is right. That's right.
You know, and yet in this book, you're basically making the argument that, well, all is not doom and gloom. And so that's kind of what I would like to talk to you about today. And I'd like to start with one question, which is, what are some reasons? I think I had asked you in the email, maybe 3 reasons. Why should we, given all of the stuff that you have studied in terms of, overpopulation, which continues to just go sloping up, and, environmental destruction, and, conflict between groups, what reason do we have to be hopeful that we can solve this problem or these problems now?
Well, Douglas, I think we can't underestimate the incredible challenges that humankind faces. We have profound economic challenges around the world. I mean, half the population of the world still lives on less than $5 a day. Almost half of the population of the world. Is climate change issue that we're facing could be a deal breaker for our children, could produce staggering disruption, social disruption, even societal collapse going further into this century. And there are many other challenges. We're experiencing this worldwide pandemic right now, and it seems like humankind doesn't have the institutional arrangements within our societies and globally to really cope with a lot of these problems effectively. And as you say, our population is still soaring, heading towards 10 billion or plus on the planet. And there's some real questions about whether we'll be able to feed ourselves, feed everybody on the planet by the end of the century. So you ask, what reasons are there for hope? I wrote this book, Commanding Hope, because I was very concerned about my children losing hope. This sense that I had that they might grow up and emerge as adults into a world of turbulence and violence and social disintegration. It caused me deep anguish, and I realized that the thing that would be worst for them would be that they would lose hope. So I decided to focus the book on how we can think about hope in a way that makes it more muscular, makes it more appropriate for the extraordinary challenges we're facing within our societies and around the world. So reasons for hope, I think that there are three that I identify that I think are genuine reasons for hope. And I'm not, as you indicated, I'm not somebody who comes to this easily. I spent most of my career studying the nature of the crises, diagnosing the problems we have. Mm-hmm. So to think about how to move beyond that more prescriptively is something that has been a genuine challenge for me. But first of all, I think that this is one of the first times in human history where we have a very clear situation of shared fate on the planet, where, especially when it comes to things like climate change, we're either going to live together and prosper together, or we're going to die together. I get sometimes asked by folks, where can I go? Where can I go when things start to fall apart? Where can I go when climate change gets to be crazy and there are fires and floods and storms everywhere? And my response is nowhere, because we're actually locked together in this very small planet, approaching eventually 10 billion of us. And it's not the case that some of us are going to be able to go to some place on the planet, wall ourselves off, and just be safe there. The problems that we're experiencing, whether the pandemic today or climate change tomorrow, are going to spill across boundaries and affect the entire planet, and everybody is going to suffer. So we either need to pull together and solve these problems together, or we're going to slide down the slope eventually towards social disintegration and massive violence together, and even the extinction of the species in time. So this is a situation that is unprecedented in the sense that we're actually aware, for one of the first times in human history, as a species, of our shared fate. We have an accurate understanding of the problem of climate change, a scientific understanding of the problem of climate change. Whereas in early modern Europe, when Europe was affected by, say, the Black Death, the people there knew that there was a terrible problem they faced, but they didn't understand where it was coming from or how to address it. We know what to do. Mm-hmm. The second reason for hope, in addition to this fact that we have this vivid realization, or should have a vivid realization, of our shared fate on this planet, is that we're incredibly well connected together. We are in a situation of connectivity on this planet unlike anything ever experienced before in human history. And just to take one example, between mid-March and mid-April of this year, almost 4 billion people on the planet locked down. So that was a massive flip and change in the behavior of the human species. A very substantial fraction of the human species, almost instantaneously. I would say that 1 person in 1,000 had ever heard of the term social distancing or physical distancing at the beginning of 2020. By the middle of April, billions of people around the planet understood that concept and realized its importance, and were implementing changes in their behavior as a result. And that was a function of this extraordinary connectivity and information transfers and the massive learning that can happen at a level of the whole species, the whole planet, very quickly. If we can do something like that so quickly in response to a pandemic, then there may be possibilities for other kinds of sudden behavioral change and shifts in the way we do things with respect to, say, a problem like climate change. So that connectivity, I think, is an enormous reason for hope. And then the final reason of the three, is that there are opportunities, it appears, for a kind of sudden shift and major flip or transition in the behavior of the human species and the behavior of our societies now that haven't been available before. So again, the pandemic is a really good example. We went from one state to another state. Sometimes these flips are happening in negative directions. In 2008, 2009, we had a global financial crisis that flipped the whole economy, the world economy, from one state into a much worse state within a very short period of time. But it turns out, and this is where the complex systems science comes in, it turns out that we've learned that sometimes relatively small things can cause these large systems to change their behavior from one state to another. After all, I mean, when it comes to the pandemic, what might have originally appeared to be insignificant mutation in a coronavirus gene, somewhere probably in China, produced an enormous shift in the behavior of the human population. Small things can sometimes, in complex systems, small things can sometimes produce huge changes. Sometimes perhaps the actions or behaviors of single individuals can produce huge changes around the world. Because of this global awareness and because of our connectivity, there are possibilities for what complexity scientists call nonlinear change, system flips that haven't been available to us before. And some of those may be positive, could push us in really new directions to new equilibria in the future. And so I think that's a genuine reason for hope too.
So let me ask you another question. I want to return to a couple of those points about the specifics, but what are the biggest obstacles, do you think, to us achieving? So you make the case that yes, we're aware of at least a lot of us are aware of the cause of the problem. We're highly connected with one another, and there is the possibility for nonlinear disruptions of a system.
That's right.
And so that's good news. What are the things that stand in the way?
Well, there are many, of course, but if I were to highlight three, I would start by highlighting what I call, as a political scientist, originally my field's political science, the structural power of vested interests. So these are powerful, politically powerful or economically powerful groups that don't want to see change. And you know, what counts as a special interest or a vested interest is often sort of in the eyes of the beholder. It depends what side of the issue you're on. But when it comes to something like climate change, it's pretty clear that there are very powerful economic interests and corporate interests. For instance, fossil fuel companies, industries such as the auto industry that depend upon cheap fossil fuels, gasoline and diesel. These are enormously influential actors, and they often have more or less direct access through lobbying and corporate influence to the levers of power, the levers of state, can influence regulation, can prevent change, and can try to undermine, for instance, that common awareness of the science of climate change. As we've seen with the issue of climate change, we've seen some fossil fuel companies invest enormous amounts of money in trying to create alternative realities, alternative science, or attack scientists who are trying to ring the warning bells with regards to climate change. So these structural vested interests are the number one reason why we're not moving in a more positive direction, or we're not moving fast enough when it comes, for instance, to reducing our carbon emissions. Now, this is completely normal and completely understandable. There are huge numbers of people whose jobs depend on these industries, and they pay their mortgages, they educate their kids. These aren't evil people or even evil industries. They're just doing what they do best, which is to accumulate wealth, the industries, and to try to influence the system so they can continue to accumulate wealth. But we've created social and political structures that allow that to happen, and to prevent change in a positive direction. So that would be number one, vested interest, structural vested interest. Number two is a somewhat related problem, and this is something that we're seeing a lot, of course, now, in the United States and around the world, but a kind of fragmentation of our shared understanding of reality. I would call that epistemic fragmentation, fragmentation of our common understanding or knowledge about reality. And especially for a democracy to function effectively and to think about and solve problems like climate change or economic inequality or immigration or education problems or the pandemic or whatever you want to put on the table, you actually have to have a broadly shared consensus on what the basic facts of the matter are. And when it comes to something like the pandemic, as we've seen recently, that common understanding, grounded, for instance, in science, has broken down in many cases. And communities have increasingly created their own bubbles of knowledge and reality, where they have their own experts, their own scientific journals, their own ways of vetting knowledge, and they don't talk to each other across these bubbles, across these divides. And they tend to regard the folks in the other bubbles as just as fake or false or ridiculous in their understandings of the world. And that is clearly, when it comes to something like the pandemic in the United States, had an enormous impact on the ability of the society to address the challenge. And around the world, it's having an enormous impact on our ability to address climate change too. Because there are many, many influential groups and individuals in the world who've decided they just don't believe that climate change is either happening or that it's going to be a problem, despite the best evidence that's coming from our climate scientists. So that second issue of sort of this fragmentation of our shared understanding, and there are a lot of causes for that. Some of them relate to social media, some of them relate to the changing nature of our larger information environment. Some relate to the behavior of particular political actors who have tried to tear things apart. But that's a serious concern I have, a reason not to be so hopeful. And then the third issue that I'd point to is an ongoing, very profound commitment within our societies to what I would call a conventional notion of economic growth, which is that we have to keep going with economic growth more or less indefinitely, because everything else hinges on it: our social peace, our freedoms, our personal happiness and well-being through our incomes. And yet the kind of economic growth that we have on the planet right now, and this is for every society, is one that demands ever-increasing material consumption, ever-increasing throughput of resources and energy, and output of pollution into the environment and damage of our natural environment. And we all talk about increasing efficiency and trying to reduce our impact. But when you look at the figures of something like carbon dioxide in output and its increasing concentrations in the atmosphere, all of the macro indicators, when it comes to, for instance, fisheries around the world, damage to pollinators, damage to biodiversity, including mammal populations, carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, almost all of these macro indicators suggest that we are increasing our burden as a species on the global environment year in, year out, and doing more and more damage. And that's very closely associated with the growth of our global economy. Now, I'm not somebody who would say that we have to get rid of growth entirely, but we need to radically rethink what growth is to try to make it much less materially intensive, less fewer cruise ships, and maybe more, maybe more things that have a lighter load on the environment, like reading novels, or even, to a certain extent, using the internet, which, more Zoom meetings and conversations like this, and less travel to conferences around the world. There are a multitude of things we can do to lessen our load that could still involve economic growth of a kind, so we could get some of those benefits. This is a very difficult situation because, as I said earlier, we have almost half the world's population that lives on minuscule incomes of somewhere around $5 a day or less. And those people fundamentally depend on growth for the basics of life: housing, education for their kids, even food. And so we have to think through how this is going to work. If some parts of the economy, the world economy, still need to grow so those people can have more money so they can flourish, more income, what's going to happen to the rest of the world in terms of our load, pollution output, energy consumption, material consumption? resources, food, iron ore, copper, all of the things that we pour through our economies. There has to be some rebalancing here if we're going to survive together on this planet. And this is not an issue that is given anywhere near as much thought as it should be. And so that's a genuine challenge to hope, I think.
It seems to me that there's some sub-obstacles within the one that you just described, because I often hear people say, well, you refer to this thing called, I think, a Kuznets curve, you know,
Yes.
the sort of belief that, well, things are going to get better, but first they have to get worse because the population goes up. That leads to economic growth. And then you get things like the demographic transition. Once people have a certain amount of wealth, then they stop reproducing so much. And that seems like I hear that kind of a counter argument against economic growth from very otherwise, you know, well-intentioned and highly educated people.
Yes, so the Kuznets curve, the environmental Kuznets curve, comes from an interpretation of the work of the great economist Simon Kuznets in the middle of the 20th century, who posited a relationship between rising wealth in a society and income inequality. And it was sort of, the idea is it's sort of an inverted U relationship. So that as you increase wealth along the x-axis, you have an increase in inequality that peaks out. And then at some point, as you increase the wealth more, that economic inequality starts to decline. So an inverted U between rising wealth and income inequality. But the environmental Kuznets curve, it was not proposed by Simon Kuznets, but some environmental economists proposed it in I suppose, the 1970s, originally 70s and 80s. It's the idea that as we get wealthier, our environmental load and damage increases as a society, as an economy, and then eventually we're wealthy enough where a couple of things happen. First of all, people have satisfied their basic needs, and they start to look around and say, "Oh, we want clean air and clean water now." So they tell their leaders to clean the mess up that industrialization has occurred, and so there's demand for a cleaner environment. And the second thing that happens is the societies or economies are wealthier enough that they can actually purchase the cleaner environment, that they can put scrubbers on their power plants to reduce the pollution coming out of power plants. They can put catalytic converters on their tailpipes of their cars. They can have sewage treatment plants. And then as all of that stuff happens, start to clean up the environment, and you come down the other side of the curve. So that's the environmental Kuznets curve. And it's not something that can be dismissed and wholesale, because there are a number of places where you see exactly that kind of relationship happening. But when you look at some of those macro indicators I mentioned before, so carbon dioxide is a good one, what tends to happen, it seems, is that we go up the first side of the curve and then level out at something very high. Maybe there's a little decline as we get wealthier in per capita emissions of carbon dioxide, but it's at a very high level. And the decline, if there is not steep enough at all in order to get us back down to a place where we're safe. And if we look at lots of different resources or kinds of pollution and environmental damage, we find that the environmental Kuznets curve actually doesn't happen. In the empirical evidence, it's fine for certain cases, but a relatively small subset of cases. When you look at the world as a whole, it's not the case that we're getting wealthier, deciding to clean up the environment, and then investing that wealth in cleaning up the environment, and suddenly, you know, the skies are blue and the forests are expanding again. Instead, what's happening is we're staying at very high levels of consumption and waste output, and continuing to damage the global environment in very serious ways. So, you know,
it's not happening.
It's not happening, and it's related to an idea that is particularly pernicious, that makes me actually quite annoyed, which is that the idea that, well, you know, maybe it's not happening, but you know, eventually we're going to be so wealthy because we've gobbled up these resources and developed huge economies that can produce enormous amounts of wealth. And if we decide that we want to fix the environment, we'll just fix it then. So this is kind of techno-optimism, which is kind of related to the environmental Kuznets curve. Oh, we'll just fix it because we've got so much money, we'll just buy a clean environment. And this, again, come back to sort of complex systems theory. This fundamentally misunderstands the problem we're dealing with here. These are complex systems. You tear them apart. You tear apart pollinator systems. You tear apart ecologies. You fundamentally disrupt the global climate, and you can't take it back to the status quo ante. You can't take it back to where you were before. You have shifted the system into a fundamentally new state. We flip the global climate. We reorganize by putting a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and changing the energy balance of the atmosphere. If that causes a reorganization of the currents in the air and the water on the surface of this planet, it doesn't. We can take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There's no guarantee it'll go back to the way it was before. Mm-hmm. This is what complexity scientists call hysteresis. You get to one place, you don't go back to where you were before along the same route that you got to that place.
Right.
And in fact, it may not be reversible at all. We're dealing with systems that are fundamentally irreversible. You destroy the pollinators, they're gone. You destroy the diversity of mammalian life, mammals on this planet, they're gone, right? You destroy the fisheries, they're gone. You kill the coral reefs by heating up the ocean so much and acidifying the oceans, which is what's happening right now, they're gone. They're not coming back. It doesn't matter how wealthy we are. We can't buy coral reefs that support 1 billion people on this planet in terms of their fisheries. So that's where these arguments get particularly almost dishonest in their facile response to the kinds of challenges we're facing.
Yeah, but
I'm starting to get heated here.
Yeah, well, right. You're in the Doommeister part of, but there's good reason for that as well. They are dangerous arguments because I know I talked to you about this book I was reading by Fukuyama on the origins of politics, and I don't know much about political science, but it was an interesting book. But here's a very intelligent guy talking about a post-Malthusian world, as if somehow now we can have in a Malthusian world, we had to have a limit on economic growth, but now we don't because we can keep expanding. And here's this really brilliant guy, putting forth this argument, and it's, I buy your counter argument. It's wrong. We can't continue to have continued economic.
That's right. As I say in Commanding Hope, where somebody like Fukuyama is coming from. I don't actually talk about him specifically, but what we did in the 18th and 19th centuries is we mobilized enormous quantities of fossil fuel energy. Mm-hmm. And we're able to use that energy through technology to push back the boundaries of resource constraints on our society. We were able, for instance, to grow much more food using mechanized agriculture and fertilizer on a certain amount of land than we were able to before. So we could support larger populations. So for a period of a century or century and a half, we've pushed back those resource constraints, those boundaries that had affected human civilization for the course of millennia. We pushed back those boundaries enormously. But we've done that by transferring a lot of the problems out beyond the horizon of visibility. And this is what I say in the book, Commanding Hope, that we punted problems basically beyond our immediate concerns. Mm-hmm. So in the process of developing mechanized agriculture and fertilizers, we ended up pumping enormous amounts through fertilizers, enormous amounts of nitrogen into our ecosystems and into the world ecosystems. And that's starting to have all kinds of negative effects. Mm-hmm. For instance, massive blooms of algae in the ocean, dead zones in the ocean and the like. Nitrous oxide that's helping to warm the planet. With our mechanized agriculture and with all of our mechanization, transportation, we produced huge amounts of carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide, of course, is warming the planet. But all of those problems were further down the road. When we started doing this stuff in the 19th and then through the 20th century, we were releasing all this carbon dioxide, but we couldn't see it. It didn't seem to matter that much. We were releasing huge amounts of nitrogen. It was all beyond what I would call the horizon of visibility or our awareness horizon. Right. And now those problems are back. Now all of a sudden, what we thought we'd liberated ourselves of these constraints, all we really did is we pushed them back, and now they're starting to impede back on our systems through things like climate change and dead zones in oceans. So Fukuyama is writing during this period of time, at the end of this period of time, where it seems we've liberated ourselves because of our massive access to energy and our technology. But all we've really done is punted the problems out so that they've become bigger and more complex.
Yeah.
And yeah, but here I am sounding like a Doommeister again.
No, well, that's okay, because it is something, certainly it's, I don't think you even ever argue in your book that this is an easy problem to deal with. I do wonder about the extent to which information alone will do it, like, is it just the case that the facts, so you say that everybody knows now, at least intelligent people who study environmental science and, many political scientists and social scientists, they know, we know what's happening, okay? We can see global warming. To me, global warming is just a small part of it. People could argue about global warming, but can you argue about all of the trash we're producing?
Yeah.
Can you argue about all of these other consequences that we're seeing? The crowds, and all of this kind of conflict over migrations, gigantic numbers of people who are now homeless, who are wanting to get into Europe and North America. It seems to me that global warming is almost, that may be invisible, but a lot of it is absolutely visible.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the trash and the plastic ends up in this huge gyres in the middle of the ocean, like the in the North Pacific plastic mass that
Right.
we've learned about. And so, in some sense, that's beyond the rise of visibility. But the other thing is that we adjust. We have this problem as human beings, and as a psychologist, you know about this very well. It's this problem of adjusting baselines, of shifting baselines.
Right.
And when problems develop slowly, we adapt. We don't see that the sky isn't as blue, or that the society is much more crowded, because the changes happened over a period of time. And occasionally we might be reminded, oh, it was different once, but it's a long way in the past and we've kind of adjusted. But there's a deterioration in the quality of our experience, the quality of our life over time, and an increase in stress levels too, that I think fundamentally affects people's attitudes towards the world. So I think, in terms of hope, right? I think that, and I argue for this in the book, I think the starting point has to be a very realistic understanding of the seriousness of the challenges we face. So that's about information in part. It's also about a kind of relationship with truth. Rather than fooling ourselves, we need to take this stuff on board, understand it as best we can, and then within the context of that, what might seem quite dire situation, try to start exploring for what the possibilities are. I don't think information by itself is enough. I don't think hope by itself is enough. But I think both of those two things are necessary conditions for moving ahead. We need to be informed, and our hope needs to be realistic. It needs to be what I call honest hope, as a starting point for making that hope work for ourselves, work for us to produce real change. But as you know, in the book, I think this is going to be a political challenge. This is going to require political action by large numbers of people to change structures of power in our society. And that's going to be a messy process. There's no easy route here. People can be informed, they can be mobilized, but ultimately it's about changing the way our institutions and technologies work. And that's a big job. And go ahead.
When I talked to you yesterday, I thought you had talked to me about some smaller things, like what can a person like me, or the woman who cleans my house, or the guy who I buy groceries from, what can us regular people do if we're not politicians or political scientists and we can't influence, or maybe you'd argue we should try to influence our leaders, but what can someone like me do to try to help out here?
So I think influencing our leaders is part of what it's about, and we influence our leaders through sometimes individually, but rarely, usually through some kind of mass action, either through our votes or through protests or through mobilization of some kind, and that involves the commitment of huge numbers of individuals making decisions. I'm going to write this letter. I'm going to make this blog post. I'm going to get involved. I'm going to vote for X rather than Y. So this aggregation of individual decisions is enormously important. It has to start at the level of individuals. Now, we can assume that each one of us will just have a little impact. And that's probably not a bad way to approach it. A little impact in our communities and our households, changing our practices when it comes to consumption and waste and stuff like that. Um, Little impact in conversations we have around the dinner table with people we think are not terribly well informed about these issues and we want to get them more involved. Little impact in terms of how we educate our children. There are all kinds of small things we can do, and those are important, especially when they're added up. But there's also the possibility that even single individuals can have enormous effect in themselves at the right times and places. And I talk about a couple of examples in the book. I talk about a housewife in Connecticut, Bridgeport, Connecticut in the 1950s. Her name was Stephanie May. And I stumbled upon this case through a remarkable serendipity, but a wonderful story. And I tell the story all the way through the book, basically. Start out with Stephanie and tell the story of her experience. So she mobilized mothers in the United States to oppose testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. So most of us don't realize it, but in the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union were testing hundreds of weapons, atomic bombs, thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs in the atmosphere, and literally shrouding the whole planet in radioactive material that was working its way up, bioaccumulating through agricultural systems, for instance, and being concentrated in things like milk that people were feeding to their kids, raising the risk of leukemia, substantially raising the risk of leukemia for children. And Stephanie found out about this, and she decided to do something. And she started with one other housewife in her little town, phoning local clergy and asking them to distribute a petition to their parishioners, and in those days, this was not something you did on the web. It was all by paper, right? And they had Gestetner, and they were using carbon copies on their typewriters and everything. And to cut a long story short, within a couple of years, she had mobilized tens of thousands of women across the country. And eventually this movement went global and had a very substantial influence on both the United States and the Soviet Union in the first major arms control agreement, which was the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, which put nuclear testing underground. And almost immediately, the levels of radioactivity in the natural environment started to decline. And by 20 years, it was pretty well back to normal. And so Stephanie's story, she was a remarkable woman, but she was kind of a regular everyday person too. What I focus on in the book is the nature of her psychology and the nature of the hope that she had that motivated her through these difficult times. And in the course of her activism, she got to know some of the most interesting and powerful people in the world. And she had correspondence. I had worked with her scrapbook. She had correspondence with some of the most powerful politicians in the United States and Washington. And they knew her, and they knew the power of the mothers that she brought together on this issue. So there's an example of one individual back in the 1950s who had a huge impact. More recently, there's the case of Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish, now young woman. She was a girl at the time she started. If somebody had said in 2000, let's say 2017, there's going to be a 14 or 15-year-old girl sitting on the steps of the Swedish Parliament building with a little sign saying "school strike" in Swedish and her school backpack. And by doing that, she's going to galvanize a global movement of people, not just young people, but people of all ages, tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, to protest inaction on climate change. We would have derided that as a silly idea. It's never going to happen. But there's one individual who's made an enormous difference. And I think, I think that we all have the capacity potentially, depending on our circumstances and our particular skills, to produce extraordinary change. It might be a matter of serendipity. Maybe Stephanie was in the right place at the right time. I think that's part of it. But we never know whether we're in the right place at the right time until we try. And we've all got a lot to bring to bear on this issue. So those are my answers to what the everyday person can do. I think regardless of what role or position we're in our societies, whether we're cleaning a house, working as an accountant, an artist, a doctor, an engineer, a teacher, a clerk in a store, we all have something we can do in our lives, and probably a lot. And I think the first step is to use some of this hope to encourage our reflection on where we're going to be in this struggle going forward as individuals.
So, I mean, there's two things as I'm listening to you that strike me as possible rules of thumb. One might be your Stephanie May example is great because you describe her. Now, I'm an older person, so I recognize some of those names. Hubert Humphrey. I don't know if she talked to Barry Goldwater, but she talked to some big Republican.
Yeah, no, she never had any interaction with Goldwater, but she did have some funny interactions with Humphrey.
Well, wasn't there a big Republican who she spoke to as well? I think it might have been Everett Dirksen. It was one of the big names that she.
Well, it was Bush.
Oh, Bush. Oh,
Bush Senior.
Father.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, it was Bush and Hubert.
And she got Eisenhower personally to order the head of the Atomic Energy Commission to write her a response to her criticisms, which is actually an extraordinary exchange because she happened to know her stuff and she wrote back to him and said, "You're wrong on this, you're wrong on that, you're wrong on this." It was quite something to see.
Oh, great. And you talked about she even was interacting with Bertrand Russell, who was not a politician, but certainly was an opinion leader at the time.
And they became very good friends. Yes.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there's one woman who's just, living in the suburbs somewhere in Connecticut, was it?
That's right.
But so I think that trying to aim high in terms of your influence would be a good idea, and trying to get try whatever you can do to get lots of other people involved is, I think, something. Both of these people who you described, Greta Thunberg and Stephanie May, they both did something sort of embarrassing. They went out and carried a sign in public. You also described Stephanie May going outside the Russian embassy in New York or something along those lines.
So I think that's a great question. Yes, so sometimes this kind of activism will involve pushing the boundaries a bit, pushing our personal boundaries, doing things that perhaps we would find a bit uncomfortable and a bit embarrassing. I talk about Stephanie May in the book protesting in front of the Soviet mission in New York because the Soviets had just started this massive new round of testing and she was appalled by it. And she was especially appalled because the groups she was working with across the country were often accused by folks on the right of the political spectrum of being pro-communist. And yet they had always been as equally critical of American testing as of Soviet testing as they had been of American testing. And here the Soviets have broken a moratorium in testing, and there was a massive planned series of huge bombs in the atmosphere. And so she set herself up in front of the Soviet mission and went on a hunger strike for about 6 days, walking back and forth in front of the Soviet mission. Eventually got national attention for her work and for the protest. And she talks in her memoirs about how uncomfortable that was and how deeply dispiriting it was. And yet eventually she promoted similar kinds of protests all across the country that helped contribute to the momentum to stop testing with the final test ban treaty in 1963. So yes, sometimes we need to get out there. Sometimes we need to use our imaginations to think, if I do this, it will catch people's attention. If I do this, it will make a real difference, even though it might be outside the boundaries of conventional behavior. And I think that's where we need to go in this urgent situation that we face as a species.
Yeah. So, I mean, the other thing that I'm thinking about, and I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but I was thinking before, it isn't necessarily all informational. I mean, as scientifically oriented people, we have a tendency to think like, if you don't understand my argument, I'll state it more loudly and clearly with more facts. And that doesn't always work when the opposition is emotionally based. When I'm a lumber company, I work for a lumber company, and my interests are not shared with you. I don't necessarily want to hear. We could hear the same argument. Two smart people can coming to completely different conclusions based upon that. And I think some of it might be, I think that in some ways, maybe we need to just make it more hip. I mean, like, for example, the anti-Vietnam War or the civil rights movement, there was something about them that they were also kind of stylish. There was something that was hip and young, like this summer, the Black Lives Matter kinds of protests. And they did kind of branch into some things that were, like some destruction of property that was, used against them. But there was another part of it, was this spirit of, kind of us doing something, crusading together for something that's kind of
Absolutely.
cool and good and nice.
Right, and there's even an entertainment part to that, that is contributing some meaning to our lives, giving us a sense of purpose and possibility. So I think it's actually at the intersection of these emotions, how we react emotionally, and our actions and our ethical commitments, where these kinds of changes really lie. So you're absolutely right. It's not just about reasoned argument and more information. It's about engaging with people's hearts and people's
Yeah.
souls, their sense of possibility as individuals and as societies. And this is an area where we're only beginning to do research that really helps us see the possibilities for change. But when you get millions of people together around something like these climate strikes at the end of 2019, that's an emotional project. It's a project with a particular ethical commitment to the future, a vision of a more positive future that gives people a sense of optimism. And we could use much more of that today, I think.
Yeah. So I'm actually thinking, again, it's not the rational kind of conversation that we as researchers tend to have, but I'm imagining that one of the other things that went over well during the anti-Vietnam, it was like the peace sign, just a peace sign. And then I was in Canada. I actually went to Toronto to dodge the draft, but I came back. But I remember it was the first time I ever saw anybody do this. A couple of hippies outside in some area of Ontario made this sign, and I asked somebody, "What does that mean?" They said, "Oh, it's a peace sign," and then people started wearing the shirts with the, and so I sort of think, and then music, like there was a group, Country Joe and the Fish, singing 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? That there was a sort of, it almost strikes me that there might be some wise, rather than just investing our efforts in, getting more information, of which there's plenty out there already to let us know. Maybe we need music and T-shirts and concerts and
movies and videos and YouTube clips. And I think, again, you go back to what I was saying before, there's a role for everybody on this, and it's an emotional, ethical engagement as well as a rational engagement if you're going to bring large numbers of people together. But I think there actually is an opportunity to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, given this connectivity, the emerging sense of shared fate. There's an opportunity for human beings as a whole to develop new worldviews, new value orientations towards living on this planet together that haven't been explored effectively yet. I think frankly, this is the intellectual domain that you inhabit, the domain of psychologists and social psychologists who think about the interaction between emotion and reason, and emotion and ethics, and how people build movements together around those emotions.
Well, there's the other thing you talk about in the book, which I think overlaps social psychology and political science, which is worldviews. That there's room for, just as there's this sort of scary Mad Max thing you talk about. And I think some of these people find that the people in Michigan who tried to kidnap the governor, they probably find it appealing to belong to a tough group. We wear scary looking clothes, we carry scary looking guns, and we are a tough group. And I think that there's this other kind of thing, belonging to a group that is doing good, a group that's, one of the other things that was a symbol of my generation of sort of, quote, hippies, was people started driving little cars. It was kind of a hip thing to drive a Volkswagen Bug instead of a big Cadillac or Buick or something along those lines. And there's actually some research that one of my graduate students did on going green to be seen. There's a sort of a status association between driving a hybrid car. And when people in Hollywood began to drive, like Leonardo DiCaprio bought himself a little hybrid car, and then it became kind of hip. And so I'm actually thinking that there might be some work to be done that isn't just about convincing people, as you point out. the facts are already there. Now I think we need to make it hip.
That's right, and need to give people a sense of personal purpose and possibility
Right.
through these movements, and a sense of excitement. Make it something. I talk at the end of the book about having the project as a species of allowing nature to flourish again, rebuilding
Yeah.
nature in new ways, and seeing. I have this concept of a hero project, seeing
Yes.
ourselves as individual heroes in this larger species-wide project of turning things around. I think that I think it's true. There are enormous opportunities there for approaching this in new ways and applying new kinds of knowledge, complex systems knowledge, social psychology to
Mhm.
these challenges.
Yeah, I like Stephanie May. I'm imagining a T-shirt with, instead of Che Guevara, it has Stephanie May on it. That she be the role model, because she's that's a fabulous story that you uncovered there. And I do think that, just in the same sense that Martin Luther King is a kind of an icon of what can be accomplished, I think Stephanie May is a much lesser known potential icon for
Yes.
what what we could accomplish. And I think people do have a sense in which they would like to do good. Probably even the people we regard as the bad guys now, they think that they're the good guys, and making
That,
this.
that's right. And there's much more potential for actually having a conversation with them than I think we realize. I mean, in the end, we all care about our kids, and
Right.
most people are sensible enough to realize that the futures for our children are very much in doubt right at the moment. So that's a reason for us to come together.
Yeah. No, I think that's one of the, another one of the anti-war things was a picture of a kid holding a flower or something like that,
That's right. Putting a
And
flower in the end of a gun barrel.
yeah, right. That one was also another one. But there was something like, what if they gave a war and no one came?
Yes, yes.
Uh, and I think that imagery like that is probably what's required at this point. And it's at any rate, I'm uplifted talking to you, and I appreciate your being willing to talk to me. And
No, it's been delightful, Douglas, and thank you very much.
and reading your book has at least inspired one person to do a little bit more than I've been doing in the past, to be more hopeful. So
Thank you. That's
far
wonderful.
out, man.
Peace.